attended council hearings in person. You've tuned in to our televised proceedings on Channel 13. Now, you have the chance to listen to us on the radio as we demystify the work of the people who do it. This is not a council hearing. This is Hearing the Council with your host, Josh Gibson.
Thank you, deep voice person with a funky backbeat. Indeed, this is not a council hearing. This is Hearing the Council. You can't have a government without a council, so you can't have a government radio station without a council show. This is it. I'm Josh Gibson, Director of Communications for the Council. You may also know me as the Council's voice on social media at Council of DC. And I want to thank our guest today, Ward 4 Councilmember Lewis George. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me, Josh.
And I apologize to viewers and to you for the delay and the technical difficulties. Working from home, still a year in can be an issue.
Yep. I'm like Councilmember Gray. I forget that I'm on mute a number of times.
Yeah, we're all still rolling with it.
Yep.
Now my first question is the most basic question. In doing the research for this and watching some videos, I've seen your first name pronounced different ways, and I'm wondering what it was when you started out as a child, and if it's still the same now or if it's evolved.
Well, yeah, so there's an interesting story there, which is my parents are the ones who disagreed on this name, disagreed on the pronunciation of the name. And so what's interesting is my mom calls me Janeese, and my dad calls me Janeese. And so what happens is it's just a hilarious back and forth where some of my family members are like Janeese, and then some of my family members call me Janeese. So there's really actually no wrong way to say it. You just choose whether you want to be on my mom's side or my dad's side in the debate.
Please, I'm not going there.
Professionally, I go by Janeese.
Gotcha. Yeah, because some people even were saying Johnny's.
No, that's not in the debate field.
That one's straight out wrong. Now the other naming question I had for you is JLG. Is that frowned upon? Is that accepted? Is that recommended and endorsed?
I think it started off as like a few of my friends saying, let's just call you JLG for short, because that's a mouthful. And I was like, well, no, I think that would be too close and synonymous with like the AOC thing. But now it's true. It does actually help people not have to say the mouthful of Janeese Lewis George. So it's welcomed, and people can use it.
Gotcha. Now in doing and I should back up a bit. Our first Hearing the Council interview with each council member is always biographical, getting to know you, hopefully trying to dig up a couple interesting biographical details we can chat about. And then the subsequent interviews are all about policy. So some of this is going to seem a little obscure, but the idea is to let people get to know you as a person before we dive into the hardcore public policy. So in doing the background research for this, someone who really jumped out at me was your grandmother. And it seemed like she showed up in the stories. Now, first of all, one thing that interested me was it seems like she lived around 13th and T, I heard you mention.
Absolutely, yeah.
And you said in one interview you'd go with her to the flea market.
Yes.
Now, I remember that flea market. I went to that flea market. Now, I'm not sure how old you were when you went to the flea market, but are you a flea market person, or were you just keeping your grandma company?
No, I'm a flea market person. This blazer is from a flea market sale. And so
this shirt is vintage, so I'm right there with you.
It is. So I'm a vintage lover, but yeah, my grandmother would always walk us around the corner to the flea market. And we would go shopping for anything, and we'd always be able to pick out one thing. And so that was always just a fun thing we did. And then we go to the flea market, and then we go to Ben's Chili Bowl, which is right up the street, right there near the flea market. And we'd always get a half smoke from Ben's Chili Bowl. And then I would say, Grandma, can we get ice cream right after? Because that market is still there on the corner of 13th and T Street, that corner market. And I always wanted to get an ice cream sandwich, the Neapolitan with the ice cream sandwich. And grandma said, well, you just had chili, so let's wait a little bit before you get ice cream. And I always would be like, okay, how many hours do I have to wait after I eat chili to get a Neapolitan ice cream?
Right. It's like you're not allowed to swim an hour after eating, and you got to wait X time after your half smoke before you can have your
Exactly.
Chalk Van Straw ice cream.
Yeah.
And so have you always been in the vintage clothing category, or for your item, did you get different stuff, toys sometimes, or at the same time?
I've always loved just vintage shopping. I like, some of the leaders who inspired me the most, right, are, civil rights leaders, Shirley Chisholm, even we talk about journalists like Ida B. Wells, they were always dressed like really, and when you look at like the civil rights marches, sometimes when I go to marches, people are like, why are you so dressed up? I'm like, if you look at the march photos, right, Coretta Scott King was, dressed up, and so I've always just been into to the vintage look and sort of the style of the 1960s and 70s. And so, you go into any of our vintage shops here in the district, even like some of the non-vintage shops, right? I go to the, on Georgia Avenue, we have a thrift store that is everyone loves and knows to go to. And I get a number of items from there. Sometimes I travel all the way out to Langley Park to Value Village, and they have some great finds, and you can get some really nice suits. I love a good suit, and so yeah.
Yeah, we'll catch up offline because I got some other
Awesome.
Montgomery County, and I have a couple go-tos out there that I think you like. But and the other thing, speaking of the civil rights marches, what's fascinating to me is the attendees. Now, not just the speakers, not just people on stage. Attendees were dressed to the nines.
Oh yeah.
And everything are just out of control. So sticking with your grandmother for a bit. So she was this is your term. I think it's a great term, lunch lady.
Yes.
And so was she a great cook just in general?
Yeah, she was a great cook in general, but she was always my grandma was always super like healthy, balanced meals. So when we were younger, we would get, in the morning, she was like, oh no, before we're going to eat this banana. And then she wanted to make sure you hit all of the nutrition groups.
Yeah.
So in many ways, she was a stickler too, into making sure that like each of your meals were balanced, which sometimes as a young person was like frustrating, but as I got older, I realized the benefit of it. So she was a great cook, but she also was like a super health stickler in a lot of ways.
And back in the day, they were doing all the cooking from scratch in the kitchen.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So she knew all the principles of deal. I had Mr. Moss, and then there were before Mr. Moss, the principal. I'm gonna blank on his name. But yeah, she knew what kind of meals they really liked and what they what was a good meal and what the students really loved as far as what day it was, and yeah.
And did the school recipes come home, or did the home recipes go to school, or were they just two separate worlds?
I think the home recipes went to school actually, in a lot of ways. Yeah.
Gotcha. I would have loved that. And so one of the key connections again for your grandmother is that when time came for you to get to middle school, your and what'd you call your grandmother?
Grandma.
Grandma. Okay. Sometimes people have different family names.
I know they're the new cool grandmas who like Mima and other names. My grandma was straightforward, just grandma.
Yeah. Mine too. But when it was time for you to go to middle school, she got involved in that process to make sure you ended up where you ended up. Can you talk a bit about that? Where you ended up and how she got involved?
Yeah. So, and by the way, I'm the youngest of siblings. So I'm the youngest of 5 total. So my 2 older siblings went to deal before me. My brother's 3 years older than me, so he was right before me.
Okay.
So my grandmother, we knew sort of how that process went. How you put your name in for the special permission and to go in to deal. And, she'd been there a number of years, and she said, she just sort of understood that it's not even just, going over there. It's the access to opportunity, but also the exposure that really just makes the difference in trajectory of our lives. And, many of, we wanted to stay. I went to Rudolph. So I wanted to go at the time, our feeder school was Paul. At the time, Paul, and I wanted to stay with my friends. And my grandma said, no, you're going to Deal. Your brother went to Deal. And I just couldn't understand why. Like, well, what's the difference? School is school. And, it wasn't until going there for the first time and, really experiencing getting on that bus and traveling over and just being like, oh my God, this is a different world. When you're on the bus for the first time, when I remember crossing Military Road and just being like, am I still in DC? And not even realizing that I'm still in DC, which was also crazy. And these huge homes and everything. As a kid, your eyes just light up. And then it was just so much exposure to just different cultures. My school at Rudolph was a predominantly Black school. And then at Deal, we had so many different cultures represented. We had embassy kids. We had such a great mix of diversity, I will say, just diversity, not only in race and religion, but also socioeconomic status. We were coming from all over the city and meeting each other for the first time. And it was just an amazing experience for many of us. And I think that's what adds to the beauty of the school, was that we got to experience all of each other's, different cultures. I mean, we're talking quinceañeras, bar mitzvahs, cotillions. We really immersed ourselves in each other's families and cultures. And it made a huge difference in our outcome that we didn't know was going to happen, that later on in life, we knew how to respect and understand others' cultural differences in a way that I think really helps us as we went into the real world, as people would call it.
Yeah, in one of the interviews you were giving about that decision to go to Deal, you were talking about how you were thrilled to have books that weren't missing pages.
Yeah.
And that just broke my heart. I mean, that sounded like it came from maybe a specific memory or something where it was just...
Yeah, so I mean, when we were at Rudolph, we had a number of issues happen. One is we had books that were missing pages, and so we always had to share books. And sometimes you had to try to get your homework done at home because we didn't. So then our teachers would have to make copies of certain pages of books that they were missing. Books. So that was a huge issue, like throughout the process. I mean, I remember, we went like a couple of months. Our air conditioner wasn't working in the fall. The heat wasn't working, and we went through this whole issue of having space heaters in our classrooms, but still being cold, traveling the hallways. So we had to wear our coats, and usually we take it off. And then we went through a period of time, and as soon as we got through that, the summer came. And it was the total opposite, right? Our air conditioners weren't working. And so then we were trying to find ways to get our air conditioners to work. And, I remember we had that same issue happen at Deal, but the difference is, like, we had a PTA, a strong PTA at Deal where, air conditioners, we can get it. But at Rudolph, I mean, all of our, our parents are working class families, and we didn't have really the resources to do that. So, we went a couple of months without having, the proper heat and then the proper air for our school. So it just always felt like, it was always something. And I didn't know that it wasn't normal. Here's the thing. You just don't know that's not normal until you go to another school and they're like, oh wow, no one's sharing books. I get my own book. We're not, You're like, wow, this is fascinating. So you just don't realize it until, till you experience it, and you're like, wow, this is a huge difference. And you start to see, I feel like I realized at the age of 11, it was this realization that, yeah, I see what Grandma was saying about access, opportunity, resources. It just was a huge, huge difference.
Now, it seems like your activist days started early, when you were at Deal and then on to School Without Walls. And so I jotted these down from the watching interviews. You Metro Teenage, peer mentor, YMCA youth mayor,
Mhm.
student rep on the Board of Education.
Yeah.
Talk about where that passion to get involved, even at that age, came from, and maybe a little bit about a couple anecdotes from that time.
Yeah, I mean, it all goes back to my experience. The first question you asked about deal, right? I mean, I'm at 11 years old realizing, wait a minute, there is a complete difference here in access and opportunity. And it's based on, at the time, it was based on factors of like where you live or where your parents worked or what your parents did. And the reality is that, so I was excelling, going well in education, but I had peers who I went to school with at Rudolph who I just saw start to go in a different direction. And then some went in different directions and some didn't have the same opportunities that I had. And so I'm going home every day I'm going to a school every day where I feel safe and protected and cared for and resourced well. To getting back on the bus and going home to a space where I don't feel safe, I don't feel protected, I don't feel we have resources. And so it was really at a young age where I was like, something is wrong about this. I don't know what it is, but I'm just going to name it. I'm going to name it. I'm going to start talking about it. And really, a lot of my teachers, sort of were like, yeah, you're right. You should name it. You should talk about it. That should be something you speak of. One of my history teachers at Deal actually lived right across the street from me, and said, you have this voice, why don't you use it? Why don't you talk about some of these things? And so that's sort of how I got involved and just said, I just want to name what I'm seeing. And wonder if everybody else is seeing what I'm seeing as a young person. And that's how that happened. And the more that I spoke up and the more I got involved, sort of the more, activities people suggested, YMCA Youth in Government, came to our school at School Without Walls and said, we're looking for some people to do some legislative look at the government and how it works. You should do it. And my teacher's like, yeah, absolutely. So I ended up doing YMCA Youth in Government, and that took me to, we had it was a national network, so we had to go to the Conference on National Affairs, where and then I realized when I got there that everybody else had a youth governor, and then we only had a youth mayor. So this is me. Statehood is coming. Oh, yeah. Statehood is impacting me now as a young person. I'm like, wait, why am I the youth? Why am I only the youth mayor? Why am I not the youth governor? Right. And so all the issues, statehood started to come up, and we were debating issues, at the Conference on National Affairs and all those issues. And, the school board piece was a particularly interesting. I think the school board, when I served on the school board, you remember I was there with, the president was Peggy Cooper Kafritz of the school board. The superintendent was Dr. Janey. We had William Lockridge from Ward 8, Tommy Wells was on the board, Victor Reynoso. I remember all our school board members because we had a really good relationship, and those were also some really great leaders with all different personalities. So it was fun to sit on the school board with some of the most, I think, dynamic leaders we've seen in our city. And they always, even though I didn't have a vote, right? They always said, they always came to me. They always made a point to come to me and say, hey, I know you don't have a vote, but what's your stance? What's the youth stance on this? And it just made a huge difference that they always were willing to listen to what the youth response was, and also allowed me to really key in on the debate. I raised my hand and like, okay, school board member, what do you have to say? And give some real perspective from the student perspective. So that was great.
And am I remembering correctly that position does not exist anymore? The student member of the school board, or does
it? It does. It still exists now, but under the School Board of Education. So I think Alexis is the school board member now for the State Board of Education. It's just a different entity, right? That's the State Board of Education. This was pre-mayoral control. Right. It's actually the year before mayoral control of education happened. So that's, but that position still exists in the way of its function. Yeah.
Gotcha. And something else that you did that I was super impressed by was you spoke at the Millions More movement.
Yeah.
10 years on after the Million Man March,
Yeah.
October of 2005. And I pulled out this one quote, which I thought was really good. You were standing literally right at the foot of the Capitol and saying, but behind these walls, the residents are facing gentrification within our own city, ignored poverty, poor public school education, et cetera. So I want to say you're staying on message. I mean,
Yeah, no,
that could have come from a speech, before the council right now. So you were
absolutely.
on point back then.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, many of the things that I talked about when I was younger, I had no idea that we would still be debating these issues, that these would still be the center of discussion and debate here. And sort of some of it we just saw coming. We knew that it was going to happen because we were experiencing it. And so, yeah, I mean, someone was like, when I was youth mayor, we did the State of the City address. As youth mayor, you have to give the state of the city. And my State of the City address was focusing on, I talked about my grandmother and I said, I want to make sure that my grandmother can live here and stay here, and that, anything that happens in the city, honors her life, her legacy, right? And so I still feel that same way today. Yeah.
And also from that same time, there was another quote that I thought was particularly interesting. There was a post profile, and it quoted you saying, you're talking to other youth, and you're saying, when you see city council members, don't let them just shake your hand. Ask them what they'll do if you or your parents vote for them. Ask your parents who they're going to vote for, or if they're even going to vote. Yeah. Now you're the council member. Yeah. So are you having those kind of interactions? Are you having youth who are holding your feet to the fire and, directly and closely involved in what you're doing?
Absolutely. And, one student in particular, Lyric Johnson, who was one of the leaders of the Washington Met fight, right? When we were fighting on Washington Met. I really had such a special place in my heart for the Washington Met students when that fight was going on. I just saw them going to the Wilson building, and I was like, yes, I'm so proud of them. So I went over to Washington Met and had a conversation with them about how important it was what they were doing. And then after the vote happened, I knew that they were probably, disappointed and hurt and felt like, oh, I did all this advocacy and we didn't get the result. And so I wanted to go there, and I had the opportunity with their school counselor, Brian Wheeler, to go to them and say, listen, every time you raise your voice, it makes a difference. This is a fight that's long and hard. And when I didn't want them to experience, apathy at a young age. I wanted them to know that they had an impact, and they will always have an impact. And so I encourage more youth to do that work. And so every time we see that young people getting out there and fighting, it was important. I remember when the Banneker fight was happening, the Banneker students going down DC Council, and I'm like, yeah, there y'all go, there you go, use your voice. So I always encourage young people to fight. The young students at Wilson are fighting for their librarian, and I'm just delighted. I'm like, yeah, they're flooding my email boxes, and I'm like, I welcome it. Look, it's a powerful thing when students start standing up for their educators and standing up for their administrators, right?
Absolutely. So you think you're living up to your own standards that you were going to hold council members to in 2006?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so let's scoot a little bit forward in the time frame. And so when you were going through law school, and I couldn't believe this wasn't in any of the articles, and it couldn't be less important, but I still just want to know, when you were putting yourself through Howard University Law School, the articles all say you were working 2 jobs and you were waitressing. And I was just wondering where you were waitressing.
I waitress at Fire Station Restaurant in Silver Springs. It was right over the border. It's a former fire station house. And so I was a waitress there. They have, just side note, they have some of the best Old Bay wings and a great lobster a lobster crab dip. But yeah, that was my job as a waitress. And then I also was a sales clerk at Nordstrom Rack, which is like our Howard Law School is not at the main campus. It's actually near in Van Ness area. So
Right.
I got a job as a sales clerk at that Nordstrom Rack. It was easy, back and forth to and from school. So yeah.
And managing two simultaneous jobs and law school is probably good practice for the pace the council keeps you going.
Absolutely. I always say, everyone just looks at like the legal job. So you were a lawyer and you did this. And I'm like, well, the most helpful work was my waitressing and my Nordstrom Rack job. You get constituents and they call and they're upset and they're angry and rightfully so, because government should be working and things should be going well. And so there's no better training than being a server or being a customer service. I worked at the register. I wasn't just like in the store at Nordstrom. And when people want to return clothes, when they're unhappy, they don't have a receipt. It's some tough conversations to have with individuals, and when the store changes policies and, we used to take returns, but now we don't take returns
Right.
on certain items. So yeah, a lot of, the people skills, the customer service skills, communication skills, all of that comes from my work in the service industry.
Yeah, no, that I was guessing that might be the case. So
Yeah.
I'm glad there's it's all constituent service. It's all transaction. I mean, I mean that in a positive way. When folks are coming to you and they want an alley paved or
Oh yeah.
removed, dead tree removed, or whatever. Like, it's similar to someone coming in with a gripe to, with the restaurant or
My food wasn't cooked right. I asked you this, and it doesn't matter that, it's the chef who cooked the food. You can't say, oh, well, it's the executive who is responsible for that. It doesn't matter. The chef cooked the food. You're the face of the restaurant, the face of the food. Why isn't it the way I asked it to be? And how are you going to fix it? And how are you going to work that out? So it's absolutely, it's the same, takes the same skill. I always thought it was funny when people in interviews would say things like, tell me about a time where you had to think quickly on your feet. Oh, okay, sure.
Now back to grandma quickly, because it turns out that grandma had an interesting neighbor on 13th and T, if I'm remembering correctly. It's someone who might have been an employer of yours subsequently.
Oh yeah, Attorney General Karl.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
grandma's the string that holds it all together.
Yes, my siblings and I talk about all this because grandma literally, she thought of things before we thought of things, honestly, in very real ways, and made us do a number of things we later on in life were like, thank God she did that. We had to practice writing checks out. Grandma said, my grandkids are going to know how to write checks. She made us like go to swimming lessons at the Anthony Bowen. Like, it was all these things that we had to do that we were nitpicky. But yeah, grandma she's the string that held it all, for sure.
Yeah, because I saw in his endorsement message for you, Karl Racine talked about knowing you almost his whole life because of living close to your grandma. So I thought that was an angle I didn't know about, and I thought it was pretty cool.
Yeah, so I mean, it was really cool, just sort of how Karl and I knew different individuals. One was my grandmother, which apparently I didn't know that the Attorney General had moved in, moved next door to my grandmother at the time, and she never like mentioned it, but apparently, my grandmother loves gardening, by the way. So she has a little garden in the front of her house on 13th and T Street, and so she's always out there, is always talking, and people knew her. She was pretty a friendly neighbor. And I guess she would always talk to Karl about, my granddaughter is a lawyer. She a good lawyer too. I'm like, Grandma, you don't know if I'm a good lawyer. And at the time, I was working at the Philadelphia District Attorney's Office, so I was in Philly as a DA, and Grandma was basically saying, look, I know you're a good attorney, Mr. Attorney General, but my granddaughter, I think she's the best. And so it wasn't until when my grandmother got sick and ill, it was really after when she got sick that Karl, I first met the Attorney General as just the neighbor next door who was offering any support or help that he could give to help my grandmother and all those things, which was awesome. And so he was a great neighbor, great to my grandmother, and spoke at her funeral, which was really touching. And then the other connect point there was a professor of mine, Tamar Meekins, and my Howard Law criminal law professor, and she was Karl's mentor at UVA Law School. So when Karl was a 1L, she was the 3L. And my Tamar, Professor Meekins was a fierce litigator. She worked at the Public Defender Service, and she said Karl followed her to the Public Defender's office, apparently. So the story goes. And Professor Meekins actually was the deputy of public safety at the Attorney General's office. And I didn't know. So when I'm at the third round of interviews, and they're like, the next person you go to is the deputy of the public safety division. So I'm nervous. I walk into the interview, and I'm like, Professor Meekins? And she's like, hey, Miss Lewis, how are you? And it was just hilarious to see my professor. And this is like a professor where I cried in her office. You don't cry in every professor's office, but I cried in her office 1L year. Like, I'm just not understanding actus reus, mens rea. And I end up, getting the amjuring the class, which is like when you at the final you get the highest grade. So I end up getting the highest grade, and I because by the time I finished crying in her office every day, I had sort of learned, like, okay, this is how I need to write this final essay. So it was just a coincidence, and literally 6 months into, I got hired, and 6 months into me getting hired, I had no idea when she interviewed me that she was battling with the stomach cancer. And so she unfortunately passed away, while I was serving as an attorney general. And it was just interesting because she was a mentor to me and a mentor of Karl at different points in our lives, but it had such a strong impact. And she was just really a phenomenal litigator, one of the best in this world, for sure.
Yep. Some folks who are mentors tend to be serial mentors.
Yes.
They tend to, yeah.
Yeah. Even now with the president of the Washington Teachers Union, Elizabeth Davis, so many stories are coming out, and I thought, Elizabeth Davis is a mentor to me, and then I hear so many other stories, and she was that same mentor to so many other young women.
Now, talk to me, during your time in Karl Racine's office, you were a prosecutor, mm-hmm. but you are a well-known progressive. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of, Twitter trolls or whatever would say, how can you be progressive and a prosecutor? How does that fit together? Mm-hmm. Is that a contradiction in terms, or is that kind of a perfect pairing to have those two mindsets simultaneously?
Yeah, that's interesting because speaking of my professor Meekins, the first thing she said to me when I went into that interview, and it ties back to this, is, so how's your theory going? So at Howard Law School, as you know, Howard Law School is, speaking of like civil rights activists and, Charles Hamilton Houston, Thurgood Marshall. And one of the biggest debates in our law school around criminal justice is, should you be a prosecutor? Should you be a public defender? Once people know you're a litigator, you sort of have to choose which route you go. And most of our professors are public defenders, and a number of our professors were former prosecutors. And so, I had two professors on both sides of this. And I took on the stance in law school, after doing, mock trial and everything, that like the prosecutor has a lot of power, right? So we went in, we observed courtrooms, and I would observe, some of my professors who were the fiercest public defenders, lose a case, lose an argument, even though they had the most well thought out argument, and was absolutely right. And then I would see prosecutors make an argument, and it would be like the most effective thing ever, and they would do it. So I came up with, I said, in law school, I said, I think, we got to get some more people as prosecutors and not just public defenders, right? I think change has to happen from the inside out. not the outside in, or at least simultaneously. We can't just leave, be on the outside fighting and then leaving, all the power to the inside to hear our argument. So it was interesting when Professor Meekins asked me that question, how's your theory going? Because she was under the theory that I should be a public defender, for sure. And I said, well, I'm learning some things about my opinion. And one is that, yes, we have to be inside of as prosecutors in the inside, but not, as a naive young law student to myself, I didn't think, yeah. And what happens also when the powers on the inside of those offices reflect the same power, the same problems that are existing outside on the outside, right? So you as a young prosecutor telling your supervisors, hey, I don't think we should prosecute this case. I don't think this is the right way to go. How much power can you wield in an office that will suppress that, right? So you have to be under, actually, all the things have to be in your favor. You have to have leadership who is on the same page as you. And so when I got to the Attorney General's office, I saw that as a welcome opportunity to be able to see, does this theory work in practice? Can we make a difference on the inside and work on the outside? And, I think my answer to that is still yes. And that it is absolutely necessary on the same token for us to have the same power, willpower within the inside and also influence the outside. Until our criminal justice system is working in the way that it should, we absolutely have to be there. So were we able to make a huge impact? Absolutely. So many cases in the power of discretion. Like, is this a case we need to charge? Is this a young person who we can save and not put into this cycle of the criminal justice system? And so, yeah, I welcome it. Whenever there's any like negativity or about it, I always am like, look, let me tell you how this looks in practice and works in practice. If I dismiss a case before it gets to a judge because I already see that things were unconstitutional, it's way more powerful than us leaving it up to a judge to deny or a motion to suppress or grant a motion to suppress. It doesn't even get to the point of that. And I think that makes a huge difference. I know it does.
We're unfortunately starting to run a little short on time. I have two last questions. No, it's good. It's good. I don't want to hold you up. But two last questions. One is, I love to compare in my head looking across history, what makes a perfect council member? Because you have your former staffers, you have your former ANC commissioners, and now you have a core group of former Karl Racine staffers. What is your argument for what, and you spoke a bit to this already, to what would make a former, someone who worked in the Attorney General's office better wired to be a council member than former council staff work or ANC work?
Oh, that's a hilarious question. Look, I don't know that a former attorney general is necessarily better at than other coming from other offices. I will say, coming from the attorney general's office, you get so many great perspectives because you touch all of the city in your work. And you also work with so many different agencies that are supposed to be delivering services to people. And so you get a real sense of how, not only of how government works, but how government isn't working because of the nature of being at within the Attorney General's office. And I think that's really, a helpful insight into that. I mean, you're in an office with 300 other attorneys. And so when it comes to like weighing issues and debating, it's like, we thrive off that. We enjoy the idea of thinking one of us has the better argument, or who has the better argument. And that was one of the best parts of the Attorney General's office, the idea that we could feed off each other and bounce ideas off each other in a very real way. And I think that was key. And it was just a I would say well-run office. And there were so many ways you could touch in different issues. So, we always could get a chance and opportunity to go to the Housing Justice Committee, a part of the office. Our commercial, our commercial litigation unit was like fierce, and we had no problem letting others like touch in and see what's happening in other spaces. So you really got an ability to hop around and get varied skills and varied expertise. But what I will say is that I think all of us, the Attorney General's office, it's just happenstance that like, it really is happenstance that I come out of the Attorney General's office and run for office, because really the root of me running for office, I don't know that Karl knew all who I was and all my past. He really didn't, honestly. But all of mine was really rooted of my experience as a native Washingtonian and sort of what I have experienced and what we've been experiencing, over the last couple of decades here in the district.
And my trivia question, that you probably already know this, but Ward 4 is the only council seat that since the beginning of home rule has only been held by native Washingtonians.
Wow.
Some in, some not, but every single Ward 4 council member has always been a native Washingtonian. That's kind of cool. That's
really cool. I didn't know that. That's awesome.
Okay, so the last question, this is how we always end our first round interview, is I want you to look at this list of desserts and I want you to rank them from most favorite to least favorite. I've done this with every council member. I have a spreadsheet and it tells us something. We're not quite sure what, but it tells us something. So
okay. Easy peasy here. 1, ice cream. You heard that in the beginning with my grandma's story. I've been loving ice cream for a long time. I also love seeking out different like ice cream. So I'll keep go that more like, so ice cream is definitely number 1 for me. After ice cream, I'm gonna go with cookies. I love different cookies, and I'll do the debate with you over who has the best cookies later. So cookies is second place. After cookies, I'm gonna go to pie. I love an apple pie, a blueberry pie, a peach cobbler. Sweet potato pie. I'm a pie, yeah. And my family's good at cooking all of these, by the way. I'll get you some blueberry pie one day, a blueberry cobbler. And then we're gonna go to cake. After that, and then candy.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll have to, I don't think I can do it in real time, but yeah, I'm looking quickly and I don't think I see anybody else with the exact same ranking as you, but if I figure it out, I will let you know. Coalition.
Awesome.
So anyway, we are unfortunately out of time. I'm very grateful to you for taking the time out of your busy, stressful day to do something hopefully a little fun. And like I said, you're welcome back whenever you want. All the future interviews will be policy driven. So whatever topics you have trouble getting them to spend a half hour on mainstream radio, we can tackle them here. So you're welcome back whenever you'd like. And we'll compare notes offline on ice cream. And
I would like to know. For sure. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you again so much, Council Member. And thank you, listeners. Remember to subscribe to our podcast on SoundCloud or wherever you get your podcasts. Just search under Hearing the Council. Thanks again for joining us. Tune in next time. We're on DC Radio at 96.3 on your FM HD4 dial or at dcradio.gov. I'm Josh Gibson. This is not a council hearing. This is Hearing the Council. Thanks so much. Take care, Council Member. Bye-bye.